Let's go ahead and get started today with an introduction to our environmental ethics module. And if you'll pull out your business ethics in action text, if you did bring it today, we're going to start in on the last chapter, starting on page 345. And as a quick intro to the topic of business and the environment, I want to start us off by covering the Bhopal case. Bhopal is a big city in India, and unfortunately it became infamous around the world in the 1980s as being the site of the worst industrial accident in history. Okay, so I'm just going to read a couple of bits here from this case study on 345. So, Union Carbide had established a plant there. They were a subsidiary of Union Carbide USA. And the direct cause of the tragedy was the leakage of 40 tons of methyl isocyanate, a gas used to make pesticides. Cocktails of deadly gases began drifting in clouds through the densely populated city streets. As a consequence, about 7,000 people died, many in their sleep. It happened at night. In the following days and months, thousands of people waited for help in the streets. Up to a total of 20,000 lost their lives during the following years. In addition, 20,000 were severely harmed and 850,000 were affected. And then the case study goes on to detail how and what precisely happened, and how Union Carbide had to pay an enormous settlement fee in order to make restitution for the catastrophe. When I look at this case, one thing stands out to me, and I commend the case to you, and you can read it on your own in total. But one thing stands out to me. I'm pretty sure, looking at this, that Union Carbide had a number of points along the way where they could have made better safety choices, where they could have made better, more costly for sure, but still better choices in terms of potential chemical catastrophes. And this is a pattern that you see repeated in case after case after case down through the decades when it comes to the topic of business and the environment. Businesses will, for years, cut corners for the sake of cost savings, and they get away with it successfully. And for years, they think to themselves, since everything is going well, we're just not going to emphasize safety right now. We're instead going to power forward with our growth plans, and they deploy their capital towards things like high profile or high visibility growth projects. And what happens in these cases is some sort of tail risk event will occur. A tail risk event is a deeply unlikely event, but an event that is incredibly catastrophic when it does happen. Okay, and so like having a car accident on the highway is a tail risk event. What will happen is a tail risk event will occur, and these companies will suddenly face existential situations because they spent years cutting corners for the sake of costs so as to expand the business. And usually they moved too quickly. One case that we're going to focus on a little bit later in this module is the BP Gulf case, Gulf of Mexico case, which happened a few years ago right off the coast. Houston may be the location of the biggest corporate scandal in American history. It's also the location, or next to the location, for the biggest environmental disaster in American corporate history. Okay, another reason to be proud of our fair city. The Gulf of Mexico, Macondo blowout, the Macondo well blowout, was also, it was exactly like the Bhopal disaster in its structure and setup. What had happened for years was BP had cut corners for the sake of cost savings and got away with it. And then a tail risk event occurred. If you look at a graph and you think about risk profiles, companies regularly plan for risks that occur in this area, but very little often for risks that occur out here. What will happen is a tail risk event will occur. And in BP's case, it almost took the company down, and the amount of litigation fees and the settlements that they had to pay was extraordinary. Similar to the Bhopal case. I want to use the Bhopal case, though, to take a look more generally at the topic of business and the environment. And when we look at business and the environment just as a general topic, and you look at polls and surveys of the American public has a pretty low opinion of business persons and the attitude that business persons take toward the environment. Okay, why might that be? Let's think together for just a minute. Why might the public have a low opinion of business persons and the approach that business persons take toward environmental issues? What might be the causes of that? Bessie?
You probably take the option that like costs less, even though it might cause damage to the environment, but since it saves us more money, then that's why they have a low opinion on business people.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Nick, did you want to add to that?
I mean, yeah, this is just like a lot of cases in general. I can't remember the exact specifics, but there was one company that really dumped in the river because it was cost effective to them to dump in the river. Rather
Sure.
than doing it efficiently.
Sure.
Was the BP case the one where they were behind like several months on an inspection of the safety valve and that sort of thing?
Oh, they had numerous processes that failed in that case. And yes, there were several safety valves and just general pieces of safety equipment which failed, they had neglected to inspect on schedule. That's right, including the blowout preventer. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that these answers are absolutely correct. The perception of the public, rightly or wrongly, is that business persons' primary aim is to make money, and if that means doing so in ways that are harmful to the environment, business persons typically do so. Okay, they dump the toxic waste in the river, or they destroy the wetland, destroy the forest. And I've talked before about this in class. It's a tragedy of the commons problem. Okay, now, forgive me if I'm wrong. Did I mention the tragedy of the commons on Thursday, or did I mention it on a Tuesday? So I did talk about it with you guys. Okay, I'll just reference it here then. It's a tragedy of the commons problem, environmental issues, because it is in the interests of individual businesses to act in ways that are environmentally destructive. It is almost always cheapest to dump the toxic waste or to neglect to filter the pollutants. And it is almost always in the interests of the collective that the business not dump the toxic waste or that the business choose to filter the pollutants. There's some different ways of dealing with this. We will talk in the course of this module about some potential solutions to make it in the interests of business to do right by the environment. Okay, and I take it for granted in talking about this topic in this class that most of us think that it is a good thing to treat the environment well. Okay, I think that there may be a minority that doesn't see things that way. I heard just the other day someone say to me, well, God gave us dominion over the world, so that means we can do what we want with it, right? And the implication was we can trash it if we want. And that attitude still surprises me. It's one, though, that I think is a minority attitude. So I think most of us think that it is a good thing for business to do right by the environment. Look on page 349, and we'll look at 3 different views of the relationship of business and the environment. Okay, so I want to talk first about anthropocentrism. Anthropocentrism simply is what it sounds like. It is the view of the environment that takes humans to be the center of things. Okay, and our book doesn't really like this view. The book says this approach, this is reading at the bottom of page 349, this approach takes the human being as not only being at the center of the universe, but also possessing an absolute right to dominate any non-human creature on the planet. Human individuals are seen as autonomous beings endowed with knowledge and the power to dominate the earth for their own use. The approach has been prevalent in business for years, supported by the belief that the technological impact on nature could be easily absorbed and by a cultural context in favor of the accumulation of wealth and an immoderate consumerism. Okay, the anthropocentrism view, although that description of it is pretty negative, the anthropocentrism view at its core is just the notion that human beings are what matters when it comes to environmental topics. And so if destroying the wetland could be done without any substantial impact on human beings, it might be justifiable. But if doing so will be a negative for human habitation in the area, maybe it could harm the water quality, the water supply quality, or maybe it could potentially harm the wildlife in a way that could ultimately redound to human beings, then and only then does it become wrong to destroy the wetland. The anthropocentrism view then is that as long as human beings are not impacted, environmental destruction might be justifiable. We saw a case like this earlier this semester when we looked at the Shell-Brent-Spar case in the Business Ethics in Action text, where Shell was looking at the possibility of sinking this used buoy platform, which had been used for oil and gas storage in the North Sea, north of the UK. And they were looking at the possibility of sinking it, and there were a bunch of environmental protests. And Shell, in the end, decided to make it into a port for ferry vessels in Norway. But I presume that Shell's internal environmental assessors at the time, this is me just speculating, but I presume that they reasoned that the impact on human beings of sinking this to the bottom of the ocean will probably be very minimal. Yes, there might be some minimal kinds of fishing impacts, but quite frankly, most of the time if an oil and gas buoy platform is at the very bottom of the ocean, for the most part, human beings won't be affected. Okay, and the anthropocentric view says in a situation like that, if human beings are not impacted, then it doesn't really matter what you do. Okay, a couple of objections to the anthropocentric view. Actually, let me just throw it open. Why might advocates of the anthropocentric view, let's just think for a second together, let me just throw it open for everybody. Why might advocates of the anthropocentric view take the position that human beings are what matter? What might be the philosophical justification for that?
I guess their position on that is probably because we have the mind and reason to like keep the economy moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Bessie. Yeah, I think it is something along those lines. If you think about the natural world, we're pretty clearly the creatures who we are aware of who have the best capacities and abilities, the ability to reason at a higher order level, the ability to plan, to work together in groups in a much more sophisticated way than anything else. So, ergo, we must be the ones who matter most, ethically speaking. And I'm not entirely opposed to that way of thinking. So when it comes to legal penalties, for instance, I would say the legal penalties for killing a human being in our legal code ought to be substantially greater than the penalties for killing a dog or the penalties for killing a tree. I think trees matter much less than dogs, and dogs much less than humans. So I'm not really opposed to the ethical view that takes human beings to be the most important thing, morally speaking. But I think the problem might come in, and we're going to look at some objections to this view in just a second. The problem might come in when we reason from that basis that human beings ought to be the only thing that matters, or that we can trash other things or destroy other things precisely because we are the dominant species. I think it's when you take it to that kind of a level that it becomes an unhealthy form of reasoning. Okay, a couple of objections then. One objection is that the anthropocentric view is a cover for self-interest. Okay, and the objection here is pretty straightforward. Of course, some people will advocate for the view that human beings ought to be the center of things on environmental topics, and that humans are the most important thing, morally speaking, when it comes to the environment, because it is so often in their self-interest to do so. Okay, it is often in the interests of businesses to say, we are anthropocentric about the environment, we think humans matter most, because actually they can make more money by dumping their wastes that way, or polluting the atmosphere. A second objection to the anthropocentric view is just that it is short-sighted to assert that human beings can impact the environment without ultimately impacting ourselves. Okay, so we are all connected is the objection. For Shell to say we could sink the Brent Spar buoy to the bottom of the ocean without an impact on human beings on this view, this objection is to make a short-sighted, to take a short-sighted position on what's going to happen over the long haul when oil and gas leaks out of the Brent Spar buoy. Okay, yes, it might not happen in the next year or the next two, but ultimately it will redound to human beings and have some sort of an impact, negative impact that is, on human life. So on the objection that we are all connected, the anthropocentric view becomes dangerous when it is used to justify policies that, while they might not have an immediate apparent impact on human beings, nevertheless almost certainly will have such an impact over the long haul. Okay, those are just two objections. There are some others I could put up there, but let me throw it open for any questions or comments about this approach to the topic of business and the environment. Okay, let me offer then a couple of other approaches. Turn the page. Okay, the biocentric and ecocentric approaches. Okay, and I'm going to cover these together. They're kind of the same sort of an approach with different emphases, but for the purpose of the lecture, I will separate them and talk about them separately. Biocentrism and ecocentrism. So in stark contrast to the previous view, in biocentrism, human beings are not considered the center of the world. Instead, what is central is life, any kind of life. Again, a little further down, ecocentrism. Here the center is not life itself, but the ecosystem or complete community of living organisms and the non-living materials of their surroundings functioning together as a unity. Okay, pause there. The biocentric view has as its gist the notion that what matters, morally speaking, are living beings. Okay, living beings. That's what gives you ethical status, is the fact of living, or the fact of, for some, conscious living. The tree does not know that you are cutting it down. I know some people chain themselves to their trees and they say, it's like ripping limbs off. Okay, look, it's not like ripping human limbs off. It is a tree. The tree does not know you're cutting it down. Nick?
Even though you're essentially killing the animal, you do that, it's
Sure.
I
Sure.
guess maybe not.
Yeah. So there's, yeah, the issues are definitely similar there. Do I have any vegetarians in the room? Anybody? Nobody? I was vegetarian for 3 years. Women would not date me. I suppose the prospect of having to live alongside someone who would only eat vegetables not eat meat was too daunting for many. So I changed and immediately got many dates. Okay. I actually asked my wife the other day, if you had met me during my vegetarian phase, would you have gone out for a second date? And she looked at me and I said, tell me honestly. She said, probably not. So, and then she said, but I'm really glad that I didn't meet you during your vegetarian phase, because we are happily married. The biocentric view is a view that says that if what you're doing is harmful to non-living things, it is more justifiable, morally speaking, than if what you're doing is harmful to living things. Okay, the ecocentric view, by contrast, says what matters most, as kind of our locus of moral attention, is not necessarily life, but the collective of the ecosystem. After all, so say the ecocentric theorists, life can't exist without supports in the surrounding setting, the surrounding environment. And it's not enough to say you can, wipe out a plant species or a tree species without impacting life, because it always does impact life. But notice that these two views can actually clash with each other. They do not always work together in harmony. How can they clash? Well, imagine an invasive species enters a particular area. I was reading a case not too long ago about a situation in California on Catalina Islands, just off of Los Angeles, off of the coast. And they had an invasive species of goat a few years ago. And the goats started breeding wildly, and the goats were eating all of the native flora. And so the local officials had to decide, are we going to shoot all the goats? Or are we going to let all the native flora be eaten up? And they decided to shoot the goats, which is actually a choice against biocentrism in favor of ecocentrism, because they are taking life in order to promote the welfare of the collective. So these two don't always work together in harmony. And they don't always work together in harmony when it comes to business issues either. Because sometimes it's actually justifiable for a company to do something on biocentrism that is not justifiable on ecocentrism, and vice versa. Okay, let me pause and ask if there are comments so far about, this is just a general theoretical level lecture. I'm just introducing some basic topics here. Are there any comments so far about this, or reflections? Yeah.
So you said, your example was biocentrism.
Oh, sure. Where something might, where something might be in favor of the preservation of life. It might be best to make a decision in favor of the preservation of life, but over and against the ecosystem. Yeah, definitely. So how about this one? Oh, shoot. Nope, that's the wrong one. How about this one? So human beings have moved into a lot of the areas of the American West that once were relatively uninhabited. And in doing so, we have brought along a large number of non-native species. These non-native species don't necessarily work well with the ecosystem, but they also aren't necessarily destroying the environment. So I was reading not too long ago, for instance, about an actual case that came before the Supreme Court of a fish. I think it was the darter, the snail darter was the name of the fish. And it was going to go extinct if the River and Dam Authority Company, I think it was in Arizona, I can't remember exactly, went ahead with construction of a particular dam along the Colorado River. And the case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And I think the dam may have been half built. And the Supreme Court ruled that they had to actually disassemble the dam because the snail darter was of such great value to the local environment or something like that. I don't know. Anyway, when I see something like that, my first thought is, wow. I am pro-environment, but that's pretty far to actually have to disassemble something that could, provide power to lots of people for the sake of the snail darter. If the snail darter had not been of value to the ecosystem, I think some would say, yeah, you should still disassemble the dam for the sake of saving the snail darter itself. And that would be the clash, even if it does not benefit the ecosystem all that much. Still, you should disassemble the dam just for the sake of saving the fish itself. Bessie.
And that would have been an example for the ecocentric.
That would be an example where some might say we should be biocentric, but it doesn't necessarily benefit the ecosystem to be biocentric. In fact, actually, sometimes a dam could be of greater benefit for the ecosystem. Sometimes, not always. They've had a lot of cases recently in Washington State where the salmon have been unable to get to their spawning grounds because of the dams along the rivers. So they have to build these salmon ladders along the side of the dam so the salmon can jump up the ladder. It's like water ladders, and get back to their native spawning grounds. I think that's cool, but sometimes I think the environmentalists take it pretty far. Like I was reading not too long ago about environmentalists chaining themselves to ships that were going to go out, and they were like drilling ships that were going to drill in the area around Anchorage in Alaska for oil. And the environmentalists rowed out to the ships, and before they set sail out into the ocean, and they chained themselves to the ships, and there were like dozens of these people, and they brought food, and they just hung out for like weeks, and eventually the harbor authority had to evict them. This actually happens in California. I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe they like hoisted themselves up on the sides or something like that, and I don't know, like chained themselves somehow. I'm not sure. But anyway, they came prepared. They didn't want to be in the ocean, so they came prepared with like everything too. People were supporting them and like canoeing out. And I'm an environmentalist, but that's crazy. That's really too wild. So, okay, let us talk about the last view listed here. And this is actually the view that I think is, speaking personally, I think is most defensible from a Christian perspective. This is the Stewardship View. Okay, so let me just read here in the text. While dominative anthropocentrism has been the target of increasing criticism, other philosophical perspectives argue in favor of anthropocentrism with a human face. Along these lines, stewardship anthropocentrism, or simply stewardship, is a philosophy based on the idea that humans transcend nature but should act as stewards of it. Okay, so why do I think this is the view that is most consonant with a Christian perspective on business and the environment? Well, it's as follows. A steward is a role or a professional position that we don't really have in our society anymore. But back in the feudal era, a steward was somebody who would take care of the lands and the manor and the castle in the lord's absence. And the idea, at least, was that the steward was there as a temporary fiduciary authority over the lands so as to improve them. Not so as to destroy them, but so as to improve them. And yes, the steward was the most important person on those lands. But at the same time, the job of the steward was not to use his importance as a basis or justification for destruction of the lands, but instead to use his position to improve the lands. Okay, and I've talked about this in class before, but this is basically the way I personally conceive of what God has done in giving us dominion or mandates over the world. God has placed us in charge temporarily of the world, not to destroy it, but rather to leave it better than when we entered it. Okay, so the steward, on the stewardship model, the steward is only successful as a steward insofar as he improves that which he has been entrusted with. The stewardship model is something that does emphasize humans as the center of things, but it's not that we are the center of things so that we can do what we want. Or, like the Anthropocentric View says in some of its harder variants, we are the center of things solely, and nothing else really matters. Rather, it's that we are the center of things for the sake of bettering the environment, or only insofar as we help improve the environment. Okay, so I think the stewardship view is the most defensible view on a classical Christian conception of the relationship of business and the environment. Now, the stewardship view is very difficult to implement in practice, and when we come back from the break, we'll begin to talk a little bit about some of the difficulties there. It is really hard to be in business and to do right by the environment in circumstances where your competitors are beating you at cost savings. And sometimes tough choices have to be made, and we'll talk a little bit about what those choices might look like when we get back. Okay, are there any questions about the stewardship view? Let's take a 2 or 3 minute break, and then we will come back, and I'll see if I can get the Barings Bank presentation to work, and if I can, we'll do that. If I can't, we'll go straight into the rest of the environmental ethics stuff.